right away, the right was saying, we will find you, right? We will hunt you down. It was like a witch hunt of sorts. We will lock you up. And then obviously Bolivian style torture you essentially, which is what the right has historically done. So that was one form of outright repression.
Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Pleased to welcome today Professor Nicole Fabricant. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Got it.
Hell yes. Who is the Associate Professor of Anthropology at Towson University. Is that right?
That's correct.
Cool. Yes. And also author of Mobilizing, Bolivia's Displaced, Indigenous Politics and the Struggle for Land. We wanted to have you on to talk about the situation in Bolivia. You know, it seems like it's sort of settled down a little bit. You know, maybe a good chance to sort of review some history and take stock of what's going on there. And sure. So I thought a good place to start maybe would be to talk about, you know, the rise of Evo Morales in Bolivia and what he's been up to prior to this military coup, right? Because kind of contrary, somewhat surprisingly among a lot of American commentators, like the business press, like he was doing by sort of the measures of capitalism, like very well. He had turned in a very solid economic performance, and he wasn't maybe somewhat unlike his counterpart in Venezuela, you know, like more or less following the democratic procedures and fairly and so on. So can you run us through that?
Sure. So I arrived to do field work the year that Morales was elected. So it was 2007. It was an exciting year. I was there to work with landless peasants in Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz has been the center of opposition to Morales and has a very strong sort of right-wing presence in the lowland area. Santa Cruz, Tarija, most of the resources are now located in that region. So we have natural gas, there's the expansion of soy, and elites have figured out how to kind of join forces across distinct sectors of the economy. But in 2007, when I arrived, it was an incredible moment, right? It was this historic moment. I mean, indigenous movements across Bolivia were really celebrating from highlands to lowlands. There was a sense that never before have we been in the seat of power. And when Morales first came on the political stage, obviously he came from a union background. He was a coca grower. He was a union organizer. Had rose to the ranks, and obviously the MAS party, political party, comes out of that history. And initially he proposed to do some really radical things. In 2007, right away, he said, we will nationalize gas. This was coming out of a very volatile period in Bolivia where there were gas wars and people had taken to the streets when gas was privatized. So he promised to reclaim, to nationalize gas. He promised to rewrite the Constitution by creating a constituent assembly, so an idea around participatory democracy and having groups across all sectors, indigenous, social movements, and that they would sit down and reflect, right, and rewrite this Constitution. And then the big whammy was that he was going to radically redistribute land. And so initially, landless peasants and movements were really excited because in the lowland region, approximately 90% of the productive land is held by less than 7% of the population. It's incredible, the stats. And so many people, rural farmers, have been kicked off lands. They've been unable to cultivate smaller scale production. So this they saw as a real stab at the historic oligarchy. And this would be a moment whereby I think lots of folks across sectors would be able to reclaim land and rethink agriculture for production, for food sovereignty. Well, that was the issue that pissed off the elites the most, perhaps. So in 2007 to 2008, when I was there, it was a series of just resistance to Morales. And really, it was around this question of radical land redistribution. I remember hearing folks say, send your money to Chile, send your money to Argentina. Communism has arrived in Bolivia. Be careful. He will seize your homes, he will seize your land, and he will seize your property. So at the beginning, I think there was real fears, right, around what this administration would represent. And that's the moment historically, I think, in which Morales came to power. There's a lot of history in 14 years, but I'm just going to point to like a few moments whereby Morales had really scaled backwards on many of these commitments. And I think that's where many of us who have done work in Bolivia for a long time have been critical of his extractivist agenda, whereby the majority of the redistributive economy has come off of natural gas extraction, which has been incredibly harmful to the environment, to indigenous communities who have been kicked off of their lands as a result of the extractive industry. There's all kinds of gender dynamics and labor relations tied into the gas industry that are highly uneven and unequal. So people have been very critical of that. People have been incredibly critical of Morales's authoritarian. And this happened around 2010, 2011. It became more and more apparent that he was going to remain in power for a very long time. It was a very vertical system of power. So despite the discussions of participatory democracy, there was a lot of incredibly hierarchical politicking going on. And so that's been a real point of resistance on the left, right? Many social movements felt as though they weren't fully incorporated into this state. The landless peasants that I worked with wound up splitting from Morales in the latter, I would say, part of his regime, because he literally made land occupations illegal. So he made it illegal to occupy or to seize land and redistribute that to peasants. And it would have to go through the apparatus of the state. And he never redistributed the latifundio land. The only lands that have been redistributed are already lands that fell within the state power.
So not only was he not facilitating and doing what he said he would in terms of threatening the elites, in terms of land distribution, but he was actually preventing the horizontal grassroots tactics of activists to take it for themselves. So he's obstructing, actively obstructing.
Absolutely. And this is part of the nuance of the critique. Like we have said recently, and I know we'll get to talking about the coup, but many of us on the left have said we can absolutely call this out as a repressive coup, while at the same time, we don't have to romanticize what Morales represented for social movements. And we have to acknowledge the very fraught relationship between lots of movements and indigenous groups and the MAS political party. Because if not, then we're creating an incredibly dichotomous situation where he becomes the hero, essentially, of the working classes. And that many people in Bolivia have felt like is inaccurate, right? So it's almost this representation that have circulated in the U.S. and international circles that elevates him above and beyond what he was actually capable of in Bolivia.
It sounds to me like somewhat akin to Lula in Brazil, like a guy who came in talking a big left-wing game, and yet ended up being, sort of hemmed in / domesticated / bought off by the, the forces of entrenched power, and yet, retained, at least tried to spread around, doing maybe what amounts to a sort of center-left type of politics, and not just
social democratic, center-left. I mean, I also would admit that the country has probably grown economically in these 14 years more under Morales than in any recent president. Certainly the inequities that we've seen between indigenous people and mestizo or white Europeans, he has managed through all sorts of like social programming and state benefits to provide supports that never historically existed, right? So, I mean, I think we need to acknowledge that as well. And the resource dependency is part of a very long history in Latin America. So, I think it's easy to criticize, but what other options for a real diversified economy do they have when in part they are dependent upon this world and global economy, right?
So it's how, the left always has a two-front war to wage, it seems. Those in power who purport to be representing the left are almost always failures and in some ways undermine the very project we're seeking to advance. But on the other hand, as we've seen in what's happened recently, that the very, very dangerous oligarchic fascist alliance that reacts against even that center-left project is even more dangerous. And so it's
absolutely. And the scariest part, I guess, there's so many scary parts of what just happened in Bolivia. But what is particularly frightening to me is in a moment where the left has really been fragmented by MAS. So there's lots of parties and indigenous movements, the landless peasants included, that were way more radical pre-MAS than in a MAS era. What does it mean when a right-wing fascist regime takes control and the left can't seem to align across so many of these differences, right? So I think we're experiencing a moment of what is the future, really? What's the political future of the left in Bolivia?
And MAS is Morales' political party, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Movement Socialism, right, is the acronym.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And this gets me to actually one more background question here, because as I recall, back when he was first elected, one of his signature things he wanted to do was to establish the international trade in coca leaves as distinct from cocaine, which has to be rendered down in massive quantities to you need huge quantities of coca leaves to create, cocaine, because Bolivia can grow a ton of coca leaves, but it'd be like an export thing. And so he wanted a legitimate market in coca to make Coca Tea and stuff, which is this like very diluted form of cocaine administration and just akin to, sort of strong coffee or something like that. And yet the United States absolutely forbade him from doing that sort of thing. And I would imagine that sort of foreclosed, one of his options to diversify the economy, right? By restricting his...
Yeah. And I think that, he had a real political presence of publicly speaking at UN spaces where he would bring coca leaves and say, coca leaves this is not equivalent to cocaine. We have a long history. So sort of educating an international community around the cultural, ritualistic practices, right, before the war on drugs, which essentially eviscerated the possibility for coca farmers to make a living off of it. And internally, the market for coca is tremendous, right? Like bags of coca leaves are sold in every local marketplace. There were all sorts of ideas for not just Coca Tea, but like coca wines and sort of industrializing coca within the context of Bolivia. It serves medicinal purposes, right? I mean, it has proven to be the sort of healing mechanism for altitude sickness, right? So people right away when they arrive in La Paz, the first thing they'll do is drink Coca Tea because it quells a lot of the symptoms for altitude sickness. But you're right. I think the international community could not even hear what Morales was saying about these historic uses and practices of coca.
Yeah. And so I guess this maybe brings us closer, almost up to the present day. And, one sort of confusing aspect of this coup here, which is that the Morales was he wasn't going around executing all the landlords or anything like that, and
Not at all.
Yeah, and so, what inspired the extreme right to make a play for power? Like, it seemed like they were sitting pretty right there. Like,
they were totally sitting pretty. And since 2014, 2015, Morales has made so many pacts with the elites in Santa Cruz. Many of them were actually within seats of power, right, around agriculture, agribusiness, land ownership. They were getting pretty much everything that they had wanted, right, from the Morales administration. Right before all this occurred, they were further deforesting the Amazon. Very symbolic of sort of this moment was the fires in the Amazon, right? Like the Chiquitania and some of the lowland areas. I mean, a lot of that has just been expansive soy production. So I don't think they had any qualms around where or how they were able to negotiate with Morales. What I personally think, and we all sort of differ, but I'll put out what I think happened, is that the threat around fraud with this election, and this was preceding even the election. So I'm sure folks knew that Morales, this fourth round was illegal under the Constitution. And there was a referendum that was in 2016, I think, and for him to run another term, and he lost that. So fraud and calls of corruption and fraud pre-existed this October 20th election, right? However, I think that there was a lot, and it's hard to tell because many of us are not in the circles of these elites. We're speculating from afar. However, I think leading up to that, there were pacts that were going on and plans. And then when it became very clear, when the OAS report came out, and there were certain vote counts, the system stopped for a minute or a period of time, and the rural votes had not been counted. I think this was a moment where the right wing felt it was a perfect opportunity to seize the state. Like, I don't think they were ever satisfied with an indigenous president in the seat of power. There was a lot of historic destabilization that I felt in 2007, where white elites were very much trying to stand up and against what they thought was an indigenous state. And that racism ebbed and flowed, but it never disappeared. And so this became this moment to catapult themselves into power, right? And I think that they used it, they seized it, and they saw it as a perfect moment to manipulate middle class, working class, indigenous people. And it was all in their favor.
Yeah. So, but can you back that out a little bit more? Can you explain there was like a Supreme Court decision, right? That gave him a sort of license to, and also the OAS, the Organization of American States, right?
Yeah, correct. So he was able to override the referendum, which the referendum was essentially just whether or not he could run for a fourth term. And many folks, even that supported Moss, felt like and Morales, that the time had come to an end. He probably should have stepped down gracefully in a dignified manner and said, I've done remarkable work in this period of time. Part of the problem is that they never cultivated real leadership. So there was never a second or third generation to take over power. And so I think that was a great fear of theirs. In this election, however, it was very, very close. The actual numbers, Carlos Mesa was the center-right candidate that was running against Morales, right? And I think the final count was like 9 or 10% difference. So it really wasn't a tremendous victory for Morales. And that's what led to all these questions around, this is so close, right? But also we know that there's significant corruption in this election. And so it was probably a combination of how close it was, but also the question as to whether the votes were counted correctly, whether people were actually voting, if they were paid off to vote, and the fact that they had not counted all the votes, all factored into this question of corruption.
What's your sense for what the people think actually went on? Do the people in Bolivia, are they split like in this country where you have Fox News brainwashing people so they think everything is fake news and they just have their own interpretation of reality? Or what's your sense of on the ground there now?
Yeah, so it's Oh, so I think it's really complicated in terms of the different groups. Like, I still have many relationships with folks in El Alto, which is the indigenous, militant kind of city in La Paz. They were at the forefront of the gas wars in many respects. Their neighborhood organizations are pretty far left in terms of politics. Many people from El Alto were incredibly critical of Morales and felt he should not have run again. And even folks were WhatsApping me when all this was going down, saying they think Morales did this to himself, that he felt he wanted to leave in a way that would not taint his legacy. And so some part of this he brought on himself. There were other people, even among the left, like this is the left critique, right? Mm-hmm. There were people that also felt like he basically was responsible for the bloodshed. So not necessarily, saying this wasn't a coup. However, he was tweeting from Mexico. He was definitely riling up kind of his bases, right, to call this fascist coup out. There was a lot that he was sort of doing to stir the pot in Bolivia. And so there was a very critical group in La Paz and El Alto of Morales. But I think that differs. There were also supporters of Morales. So people, as you saw internationally, were taking to the streets saying, this is not our president. This is an all-out right-wing coup, right? And folks pretty much from Cochabamba and the protests there, which is like central Bolivia, to La Paz, refused to accept this interim president. Then you have folks in the lowlands that are celebrating this, right? So I also have connections still in the lowlands and know a lot of the middle class, working class folks who were dancing in the streets claiming this is democracy, right? We have finally reclaimed our country. So you have this radically polarized nation where some people are celebrating, and the United States too, the diaspora community in Virginia. The largest Bolivian community in the entire United States is in Falls Church, Bolivia. And the messaging from that region was really that finally democracy will reign in Bolivia with this interim president.
Yeah.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So there's no unilinear.
No, of course,
it's hard to say this is how Bolivia. It's incredibly contentious.
Is that part of why the kind of oligarchic fascist forces saw an opening, because of the fragmentation and the complexity of kind of the different demographic populations? I mean, it must have been part of what was challenging in the first place for Morales to bring together people from, right?
Absolutely. And also the question about Fox News. I did want to say when I was there for a long period of time, I did some commodity chain analysis to figure out who was funding the different TV, because I found most of the working classes in Santa Cruz bought into this oligarchic vision, despite it's very similar to a kind of Fox News scenario in Bolivia, where the mass media is controlled by a lot of the landowners. So the same sort of large-scale agribusiness have put money into mass media.
And do they use like anti-indigenous rhetoric or? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, it's even perhaps, I dare say this, worse than Fox News, but I've sat around watching it with working class folks in the lowlands, and it is portraying indigenous peoples in the worst, just as criminals, the landless peasants as thieves, occupying your private property. So there's all this kind of pathologies of the poor and working class that become tropes and circulate in everyday discourses.
And what population, what percent of the population are indigenous? And I seem to recall like more than half. Is that right?
Yes, it is. It's an incredibly large percent. I think the numbers were like, over 50 today percent is, and that's hard because even in the census, a lot of people self-identify as one thing, but are actually mixed race, because the majority, even of the white claiming folks, would still be considered indigenous, right?
And Morales himself, I think I read in your book that it's even unclear if he speaks indigenous language, right? Or
absolutely. Yeah. So he himself identifies as Aymara and Quechua, but there were all kinds of questions around his own indigeneity and to what extent it was an authentic form if he doesn't speak the native languages. Absolutely.
Can you explain the term plurinationality or?
Yeah. So also there are very distinct indigenous groups. So of all the nations, there's lowland indigenous groups, there's highland indigenous groups. And obviously the Aymara and Quechua are part of that original Collasuyo, right, which extended way beyond Bolivia. But their culture is radically different than the lowland indigenous culture. And so this is part of also the different visions around territory, around agro, ecology, all sorts of things that Morales really took on a highland identity sort of presence, which initially lowlanders didn't feel like they fit into this state. Like, where do they fit in, right?
Interesting. And so how successful was not just Morales, but these social movements in trying to unite these disparate populations for, I think, like a socialist and eco-socialist project? Because even though, as you write, Bolivia is not at all one of the major contributors to climate change, it is definitely one of the places that's being affected by it. So was that helpful in uniting these coalitions, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially it was. So the idea of plurinationality is the idea that all indigenous nation states are kind of represented, right? The plurinational is that, Guarani, Ayoreo, these are some of the lowland indigenous groups, would have a presence in the state, right? That the state would become a mixture. So if you think about that Huipala flag, which has become a big symbol of the right resistance to an indigenous state, because once the coup took power, Añez, the interim president, brought a Bible, and there were all sorts of moments in which those Huipala flags were ripped out, right? So there were images circulating where police were cutting off the Huipala flag from their uniforms, and now it was just the Bolivian national flag. And there were lots of images traveling of people burning the Huipala flag. So the Huipala flag is the multifaceted, kind of indigenous, colorful, checkered flag that represents this idea of plurinationality.
Am I making too much of a parallel? It's kind of spooky how, with Trump and white nationalist, white supremacist, evangelical Christian, right, coalition as a response to a pluralistic, diverse opposition.
Totally. I mean, there are so many parallels here that need to be tweaked out. Part of the problem, too, is the social scientific world has not studied the right enough. And I think we are sort of obsessed and, fascinated with how the left organizes. And we find political, refuge in some of these movements, but we don't quite understand the tactics, the everyday strategies, and how the right, because this is our opposition. And even when I was studying the landless peasants, I couldn't help but be in circles where the right was organizing in order to understand what are we up against, right? I absolutely think there are so many parallels between Trump and the backlash to a kind of Obama era, right? And what's going on in Bolivia. I think Bolsonaro as well is a huge force in Brazil in terms of an evangelical kind of rightist vision. And I know far more clearly that the Brazilian right and the Bolivian right are aligned. The extent to which the right in the U.S., there's soft money traveling into Bolivia constantly supporting a lot of the conservative organizations, but I just don't know how savvy they are to act internationally to the U.S. However, I think with social media now and all sorts of forms, the young people are figuring out ways of cross-border organizing, right?
And is the reactionary right in Bolivia using similar censorship tactics like in Brazil and the U.S.? I mean, from fake news Trump to Bolsonaro's literally, getting rid of books that are leftists and professors that teach leftists.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what we saw so Añez assumed power after Morales basically was forced to resign, right? So I don't know, we haven't gone through this, but the word from Bolivia is that he was threatened. His life was threatened, and he fled, right? He fled to Mexico. First, he went to the Chapare, where his bases are, and then he fled for asylum in Mexico. And so is Alvaro Garcia Linera. And every person on November 10th that was the next in command kind of resigned because of the fears, the outright fears of being members of this political party. So right away, the right was saying, we will find you, right? We will hunt you down. It was like a witch hunt of sorts. We will lock you up, and then obviously Bolivian style torture you, essentially, which is what the right has historically done. So that was one form of outright repression. But then I think there were all sorts of ways in which there was a media blackout in Bolivia. We were only getting information because we had people on the ground in movement sending us videos, or human rights violations, like people who were murdered from Cochabamba. Folks were sending me images of the distinct protesters that had been gunned down. If it wasn't for these people on the ground, the international and the national media was completely blacked out. Yeah. So that was like repression, as much as you can say. Like, there was no left press. There was no alternative press. Even I think there was an Al Jazeera woman who tried to get to Cochabamba to film some of the protests, and she was tear gassed. Wow. And told that her life would be in danger if she continued to be amidst this.
Yeah. I guess, this leads to, I want to just sort of go through the situation here, as it leads up to the actual present day. Right. So you've gone through some of it. Basically the military comes out. You have all these threats on, like, basically the entire administration's lives. Morales flees to Mexico, and then this like loopy random senator from a tiny party, right, named Áñez, just declares herself president. So can you tell us about that? What the hell is going on there?
Would that be like just, I don't know what the equivalent here would be. It'd be like John Delaney just claiming presidency or something? Yeah. I don't know.
Like, this wasn't even a legitimate political party. She had less than 4%, not even in this election. Like, I don't even think the political party, it was generally, less than 4% were supporting this party. However, as the kind of, and I put that in quotes, kind of constitution, she legitimized herself, essentially, is what wound up happening. And I happen to believe that there was so much chaos, and it really was chaotic, because she swept in, she assumed the presidency. You could see these symbols were radically changing, right? As soon as she declared herself the interim president, here she is, this mestiza-looking woman with like blonde hair, manicured nails, comes into the seat of power with this Bible. So all of a sudden we begin to see like Christian, white European reclaiming the seat of power. And she's supported essentially by Luis Fernando Camacho, who became this national figure. Everyone has heard this name, who was the head of the Civic Committee, which is like a chamber of commerce, right? Wearing the baseball hat. And he comes into the picture as well. Even before Morales resigned, he was going to hand deliver a resignation letter to Morales. He was rallying up like the forces in Santa Cruz, really getting people to support what was about to happen. And then when Áñez assumes the presidency, I think that all the backlash was a result of lots of different social movements coming together and realizing that this was an undemocratic seizure of power, that this was absolutely, whether they supported Morales or not, it was like the violation of human basic rights that sparked the resistance. But to this day, she still has not set a date for the new elections, which is a big question. And she's only supposed to be in power for 90 days until they hold democratic election.
Okay, so can you walk us through the constitutional procedures? So it sounds like what you're saying is that once the president resigns, there is the ability for someone like this to step in the interim fashion this way, or how does that work?
There was, because so it would have been the vice president, which was Alvaro Garcia Linera. He also fled in that moment. And then it goes down in power beyond the vice president to like the head of the Senate, right? And like the vice president of the Senate. And because a lot of these people were MAS political party supporters of Morales, and there were these direct threats against them, she legitimately or however you want to say it, it's kind of a murky category, but nevertheless, she was able to say, well, I am, right, the next.
Because everyone else said, not me, not me, not me. And she's like, me. I'll do it.
She said me. And, quite frankly, the international community has kind of legitimized it. There hasn't been a ton of opposition that's clear enough to say this is a total seizure of power and, this is completely undemocratic. And so when you have a blackout of media and you have folks fearing for their lives, I think this is the result of the illegitimate.
Did this seem to precipitate more violence between the different oppositional people on the street, or did it somewhat stem the conflict, or what was the effect on that?
Absolutely. I think there was a series for a week, right? From November 10th was the day that Morales fled until probably about the 16th, 7th, like that whole week. It was a series of protests. So there were clearly MAS supporters, and the news and the word from Bolivia is that they were vandalizing, right? There was a lot going on in terms of pro-MAS folks that were angry, that were feeling like, their leader had been forced to flee this country. So there were buses that were burned. There were houses that were burned. There were all sorts of ransacking. I mean, it was a mess, parts of La Paz and El Alto. But that was coming not just from the anti-Morales, it was also the pro-Morales, right? It's really hard to distinguish where the vandalism was coming from in a kind of uprising sort of way. When I think about Ferguson and Baltimore's uprising, the one thing people are saying is, well, they're vandalizing their own property. No, this is about kind of historic rage, right? And how it manifests. And I think the same thing was sort of happening around this historic rage. And then the rage turns into just this explosivity. So we saw a lot of that. We saw people in Cochabamba that were absolutely, peacefully protesting. And this was the first massacre that occurred. The dates, in terms of the exact dates, I don't quite remember. But they had taken to the streets. These were predominantly folks that were supporting MAS, or at least standing up and against this coup. They were a diverse group of people, and they opened fire. They being military police. And so in this first massacre, about 9 people were murdered. And it was brutal murder. Like, the images that we saw were gunshot wounds all over bodies. And immediately after that, there was another protest of a gas. It was a refinery of sorts in El Alto, Sencada, where they were protesting around the gas. Gas becomes very symbolic, right, for protests around reclamation, around questions of whose gas is this, because of the ways in which the elites have, manipulated control over gas and gas royalties. And so they were protesting. They created a blockade of sorts, and that's when the second massacre occurred. And altogether, I think the number was close to 20 people that were murdered and hundreds wounded in both of these incidences. And Agnes passed a law that there was total impunity. So no one would be held accountable for any of the murders.
Damn. Yeah. So this I think is a good point to bring up the kind of international context, because you look at the kind of quasi coup thing that happened in Honduras in 2009, right. And that the United States made some sort of weak criticisms of that, but nevertheless, I mean, there was a sort of decorum about the things that the United States would potentially get on your case for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like just a nutcase right winger just declaring herself president after threatening to kill that under Obama, I think that maybe would have been sort of beyond the pale, or even just would have been thought to be behind the pale, and maybe would have restrained people from trying something like this. And so my suspicion is that the Trump administration has enabled this sort of behavior by welcoming, So you think that's the case?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was hard to get the exact social media tweets that were coming from different Republicans because they erased it right away. But as soon as Agnes seized power, from Marco Rubio to others coming out publicly and saying this is a moment of victory for, democracy, the classic kind of, now finally Morales is out. There was a series of tweets, right? And then Trump, yes, he said something clearly endorsing and legitimizing Agnes's now being the president of Bolivia. So that absolutely exacerbates it. I mean, the question too, that is not indicative of the United States right now. So there are lots of really fabulous human rights, lawyers and groups that are actively sending commissions to Bolivia. So I do think that's important because despite the fact that our president has endorsed it, there are lots of these sort of accountability groups, some of them coming from Harvard Law School, that have sent folks to document every human rights violation. Argentina sent a recent commission to prepare reports. So these reports are now coming out about these two mass murders, essentially, in Cochabamba and El Alto. But absolutely the national sort of stance of our government has just exacerbated some of these tensions, right? Yeah. But I also think that we have bolstered in many ways that is not getting enough attention, the right in Bolivia. So I said, I don't know how clearly they're aligned, but I do know that money has flowed into Bolivia historically. So U.S. aid, there's been tons of money in the 1950s in like an anti-communist environment where the U.S. funneled millions of dollars to support large-scale agro-industrial development in the lowlands, right? And throughout the years, we have kind of kept an eye on this lowland region because we saw it as an opposition party, right? We saw this as a pro-business, sort of, in the 80s neoliberal, right, regime. And so they were very much aligned with the United States. I know for a fact, National Endowment for Democracy, there's like lots of linkages between money that is funneled from the United States directly into fomenting some of these right-wing groups in Bolivia. So we can't do that, I guess, right?
It's complicated, but how much can we tell that the support for this kind of our imperialism and our capitalism basically has an interest in countries like Bolivia and their national resources not being protectionist and not being distributed equally and helping the people. Instead, we want to, bring them into the global market so the invisible hand can take all their stuff, basically.
Right. Completely.
Yeah. So what do we know about, again, because Morales seemed to be kind of trying to have it both ways and appeasing a lot of the elites by not completely doing what he set out to do or said he was going to do, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a real question that's out there for many of us right now. How much was Bolivia really on the radar? For the United States, Central America is clearly our backyard, right? And historically has been. And so it's very easy to trace those kinds of imperialistic, endeavors. However, Bolivia, much of the natural gas is going internally, right? To Brazil, to Chile, to other nation states within, which do have obviously relationships to the United States. It's unclear to me. There's been a lot of proposals that lithium was the big issue, right? And there's been some, I wouldn't call them all out conspiracy theories, but I just don't have enough concrete evidence pointing towards U.S. like meddling around questions of lithium. I know that like Japan, China, there have been certain investors in Bolivia's lithium, and there were concerns around Morales kind of semi-nationalizing the lithium industry in a moment where we're about to expand, right? Electric cars and the need for lithium is going to become more and more critical, right? I mean, talking about sort of moves towards either a Green New Deal or like a more eco sort of agenda. It's inevitable. And so I think people were looking not just at Bolivia, and this is why I don't think it was a direct relationship. It's also Chile. Like there's lithium deposits all over South America, right? So besides that, I can't see a real concrete interest right now in the resources. I mean, soy production certainly, but that's really Brazilian investments by and large in agribusiness and soy too. You know, certainly as a second or third party, we have influence. I just don't know that Bolivia was that much on the Trump administration's, like, you know, mind before this happened.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's maybe a like just an ideological affinity that they see a white appearing evangelical nutcase forcing out, you know, doing a military coup on a, you know, nominally leftist guy at least, and that's thumbs up, like sight unseen. Yeah,
well, and maybe. Sorry, no, I was just saying, as you suggested, I think when Bolsonaro takes power, the global ascendance of kind of neo-fascist oligarchic power probably motivates and inspires other vested interests around the world to kind of say, hey, we can do that here.
Totally. And like, I do think beyond, you know, you asked about Trump and the right in Bolivia. I do think that the history of fascism in Bolivia precedes maybe, you know, a lot of our sort of white nationalists. I mean, many ex-Nazis fled to Santa Cruz, right, in the aftermath of World War II. And so you have these youth groups that are formed around fascism from as early as that period. And that is a real critical, I think, link to all of this. Maybe the moment was right, as I said earlier, to really begin thinking about, you know, broader seizure of power. But we have seen these symbols of Nazism and fascism in a very long time. And it takes the shape and form in Bolivia of anti-indigenous, these youth groups that have come to receive a lot of attention, that are like the strong arm of the Chamber of Commerce. They're actually, I mean, I've tried to go in and see sort of what some part of the training looks like, but they're ideologically training people in fascist, you know, rhetoric, and have books that have been transported. They're certainly linked to Brazil, the question of how evangelical they were before sort of other spaces and states taking kind of right-wing Christianity. I don't know that, but I can say that the people that were displacing a lot of the landless peasants were these youth fascist paramilitary groups, right? And they were armed.
Yeah. So let me see. Got time for a couple more questions. Yeah. You know what? Bernie Sanders, for one, has called this a coup. And, you know, a lot of the other Democratic candidates have condemned it, at least. Right. Some, I don't think anybody quite as strongly as Sanders. You know, if he were to ascend to the presidency, you know, he would have, you know, power to sanction, like broad power to sanction governments for doing basically anything he doesn't want. Is there any sense, you know, it often feels to me like extreme right wingers are they kind of only know how to just double down. It's not in their nature to sort of like hedge their bets or not go for broke every single time. But is there any sense, do you think, among this like Añez crowd and like the you know, stormtrooper whatever youth league supporting her, that it might be somewhat politically risky to expose yourself in this way, because the next president might not be Trump. It might be sort of frowning, very sternly at you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, quite frankly, everyone's really concerned about that. Like, looking towards the United States, right now in this moment of, young people, especially like a new generation, taking climate change really seriously, taking eco-socialism seriously, putting their politics out there, right, to support candidates like Bernie and to work for him, I think is a real threat, not just to Bolivia, but to like the diaspora community, of Bolivians in the United States that see this kind of coup regime as a democracy. For them, they're going to label certainly Bernie as just a commie, right, which they do for anyone.
Until they get their free healthcare, then maybe they'll reconsider.
Exactly. See, the problem is they don't quite understand the layers of their own oppression in this country. Mm-hmm. And so they cling on to this white status, right? And it's the same in West Virginia and working class areas where I've taken students, right? Just this white, sense that somehow you can hold on to that, right? As a bit more powerful than the black or brown or, person who's working below wage.
The wages of whiteness, yeah.
Exactly. So I think that Bernie by far, Warren had nothing to say. Quite frankly, in my opinion, nothing she said. It was a typical liberal kind of perspective she had. She did not call it out. She did not condemn it, nor did she talk about the history of U.S. imperialism. Bernie did all three of them, and obviously is tied into a broader Latin American community, right? Like, understands, broadly speaking, the history of the United States.
No, yeah. Unfortunately, with even though Warren is the only other candidate other than Bernie that is anything other than neoliberal disaster, they can't be more different on foreign policy. To the extent that she has foreign policy ideas, they tend to be terrible. So that's disappointing. But
so I think most people were just disappointed with. Of course. And it took her so long. Bernie came out right away. As soon as we were in the heat of things and we were writing letters condemning human rights violations, he was the first. And then obviously the congressional group of AOC, Ilan, many others also condemned the human rights violations and called it a coup.
See, to be socialist isn't to not understand the nuances that we've just been talking about and the complications with Morales and all that, but it usually is pretty simple to figure out when some bad shit goes down and which side you should be on.
Absolutely. And how to have some chutzpah,
how
exactly. To speak out about it, right? To actually, be a political figure that takes a stand. To me, like, Bernie really was the only person that put himself out there in that way and consistently does right across most of the policy. He's not afraid to innovate.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is there hope on the ground in Bolivia too for resistance or from where we go from here in terms of responding to this?
Yeah. I mean, I always try to say I never end my classes on a pessimistic note because I hope that students will be fueled into social movements and believe in the power of organizing.
Hell yeah.
Although things are pretty grim in this Trumpian moment, I still refuse to leave them just cynical. And I feel the same way about Bolivia. I think that the history of the country has some of the most radical left-wing movements we've probably seen across the globe. Like, the miners were a faction of Trots that had a real militant politics, right? And advocated for nationalizing the mines. And I don't think we need to lose that sense of history or radicalism in Bolivia. Despite the fact that people have been fractioned across sectors, I really do believe that maybe in a moment of crisis, in this moment of crisis, it's what they needed to reach clarity and to push a real left agenda further along, right? So I do believe we're going to really begin to see some realigning in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and another, maybe as a final sort of question for you, the one lesson here, I think, for me is that this shows that the United States is so powerful that you sort of can't avoid making tremendous tremendously impactful decisions about other countries, and just like as Trump shows, just even looking the other way at something like this could cause it to happen more or less, or be the key factor. But I think another thing that may probably explains why so many of these, like nominally socialist leaders of smaller countries or poorer countries get kind of domesticated, is because they're thinking in the back of their head about Wall Street, about international capital, and about the power of the president. And if you were to put a real, even just a regular progressive, some kind of a FDR type in the driver's seat of the presidency, that could, sort of unleash people to go a little bit further in terms of, redistributing land or whatever, or at least remove that excuse, because, you see it in many countries that just the sanctions power, leaving aside Wall Street or anything else, can just wreck a place. And so,
absolutely. Bolivia is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, right? Second to Haiti. So imagine, without any U.S. or transnational, an embargo wasn't, cutting relations with the United States was not even probably on the radar of Morales, even in his most radical moments. I think he realized he was going to be dependent upon nation states in Latin America, but also transnationally, right? Unfortunately.
Yeah. And you just, as a small country where mainly what you do is export commodities, that's one of your main things, you really don't have any choice. But right. One thing you can do as an American, socialist movement is enable that international solidarity.
Well, and the other thing I think that's important about not just Bernie, but the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and, any socialists or leftists that care about countries like Bolivia, because as much as this is a clear coup with just, literally a president being run out of office and people being murdered and massacred, you don't see this on the news. You hear much about it in this country. And part of the thing that I think a leftist movement here can really do is put a lot of pressure on our politicians to make it something that we don't just let happen. So
I think that's a key point, and something I've been pushing the human rights committees here to think about is, where are our pressure points in DC? Like, how do we use these as policy briefings to make visible that which has become so invisible, right? We have naturalized the sense that other countries will just undergo military coups and essentially people will be murdered. My students had no idea what was going on in Bolivia, none, right? And I think they're pretty indicative of the general population of the United States. So, how can we think through, members of Congress, to actually read these policy and briefings of human rights violations and then bring pressure campaigns, right, that would absolutely hold people accountable in Bolivia for committing these atrocities.
And just to also develop the ethos that, extra legal, undemocratic, fascist violence anywhere is a problem to people everywhere. Exactly.
Right. That we can't just turn this blind eye to it. We have to, acknowledge and confront it and call it out, right?
And thank God with the disaster of climate change at least brings awareness, especially for young people, about how interconnected all of our global problems are. So maybe that gives us a little hope for how a socialist foreign policy and international perspective might take root.
Absolutely. No, I have a lot of hope in these young people. And I think they're going to be that next generation that does get us someone like Bernie elected. They're out there doing the hard work every Friday of really putting bodies on the line for real climate proposals and radical changes, right? So I do think in my lifetime, hopefully, we're going to see a shift.
Thank you for everything you're doing to help educate the youth and spread the word.
It's been great chatting with you guys.
It's been really wonderful. Really a pleasure and an honor to learn from you and to speak with you. And thanks again.
And I'm so glad you're bringing attention to what's going on in Bolivia, because so few media sources have really been able to delve into the complexities, understand the complexities, but also call out, right, this as a military coup. So much appreciated.
Yeah. Nicole Fabricant, the book is called Mobilizing, Bolivia's Displaced. We'll link to that in the description. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.